Believe it or not, you're my first guest who I have not actually met in person.
Oh, well, I'm
So
honored, but also that is a little bit sad.
it is your dose of Johnny C. And I know that I've told you before about my share of god awful work experiences and why I'm in business for myself. And so I stumbled across this TikToker who was talking about like all of these things on how bosses need to basically change up their tone, change up the workplace culture. And I found myself favoriting a lot of her videos. And she just had a book come out, and she also just had a huge interview on CBS News live streaming. They came to her as an expert. And so my guest for this podcast is Robyn Garrett, the author of Happy at Work, How to Create Happy, Engaging Workplace for today and tomorrow's workforce. So, Robyn, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be able to talk about an important subject.
So, I have to ask the first thing. So, I want to go into your origin story. What drove you to start talking about this, to start talking about workplace culture, manager responsibility, and sort of the paradigm shift that we're going through?
So I became a manager when I was 22 years old. So I've been in
Wow.
management for a while, but I really got thrown in there right at the beginning of my career. So I've been in management and leadership and then executive leadership for my whole career. And what I've seen over that time has been like an increased polarization between a lot of the really helpful, good research and literature and like think pieces on what makes a good leader, what should you do, what helps the culture, a lot of that really good material, and what you actually see when you're inside any given corporation on any given day, or even not even in the corporate world, really kind of in any job. And so you've got all of these rogue bosses out there terrorizing the population. And I've always been really interested in organizational leadership and how can I be the best possible boss. I have not always been perfect. I've made a ton of mistakes, but I've learned a lot over the course of my career. And a number of years ago, I shifted into like specifically working in leadership. So my background had been in marketing and I was an executive there, but then I started specifically working in kind of consulting in the leadership space. So I work closely with HR, I work with executive teams, boards, all kinds like that. And I just want to help. I realized once I went independent too that when you're inside the job, there's so many things you can't say. You have to consider all these different stakeholders and what are they going to think and feel, and how do I watch out for my team and defend them, but also present this information in a palatable way, considering all those factors. So I figured if I'm going to be independent, I better get out there and say the things that nobody else can say so that there's somebody pulling in this other direction to kind of champion for these voices that are not heard on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's good. So you mentioned, the mistakes that you made. What would you say that your biggest mistake was that you learned from, that you basically said, okay, I did this, don't do what I did?
That's an easy one because it's sort of a broad category.
Okay.
So I came in hot at the beginning of my career. I had been taught from various different sources that the way to be successful was to be sort of like as intense as possible, work around the clock. Don't share any personal information, like never say no to anything, and just be, like I said, very intense. And it took me a while to learn that not only was that not healthy and sustainable for me, but it also was not the best for building a strong team that could do a really good job. A really important lesson that I've learned is that nothing big happens without a team. You can have the most brilliant genius on earth. And if they don't know how to work with a team, very little is going to happen because you're limited by the hours and resources of a single person. And a lot of people don't understand that. They just think, how come I can't get everybody to do what I want, what I say? it's not effective. So as I started to get into concepts of organizational leadership and how to activate a team, build a strong team, I learned that I needed to change my approach pretty dramatically, that I was coming too harsh, and I wasn't taking into account the needs of all the people who were working with me. And so I needed to not just work within this structure and behave in a way that it expected of me. I needed to work on changing the structure itself.
And well, you were talking about like kind of just relying on yourself to like you were the hot shot. I mean, you said you started at 22, so of course at 22, my mother-in-law likes to say that up until 25 it's like our bonehead years.
Sure.
We think we know everything, especially like fresh out of college. It's like, oh, I nailed it in college and I can nail it in the real world. So I work for myself. I'm actually a trivia host. So earlier this year, I actually had to hire somebody. Like I got 5 venues. I have to have my days off. I have to. And I have to leave days open for, I'm a DJ. I do weddings and everything like that. It took me so long to actually trust somebody to hire, like the way that I do things. And I remember as I was training this guy, I remember like grinding my teeth and like clenching my fist. I'm like, well, he doesn't do it the way that I'm doing it, but it doesn't matter.
Yep.
He's still doing it. He's still engaging. He's still effective. He's very good at what he does. I'm like, I have to trust the process. Like procedural stuff, you have to show him how to do. But as far as like how they do it, it's very like you really do have to trust other people. And then you also you were talking about basically creating boundaries. You were talking about in the beginning never saying no. There was a speaker that came to a young professionals meeting that I was at, and he says, never say no, or not never say no, always say yes.
Always say yes.
Always say yes. And he's like, well, when you always say yes, you get like a cool opportunity, like me flying in an F-16 airplane. I'm like, that's great. What about when you're in your 20s and 30s and you're always saying yes and you never get time to yourself? You experience that burnout. And I know in my jobs beforehand, I always experience burnout.
Yeah.
And so I know, and that's good that, you, and I'm sorry to say, you're kind of a unicorn in that aspect. You learn from your mistakes as a manager to do that. We really don't see that right now. Granted, you're also younger. You're a millennial. So you've learned from your mistakes, and there are folks who are tend to be older than us. I'm not going to say the word, but they're kind of stuck in their ways. They're like, well, people just don't want to work anymore. And what do you have to say to that? Where I live, that's all I hear. Nobody ever wants to work anymore.
That's a great question. So I'm actually working on writing about this topic right now because there's a lot that's underneath that statement. And it really comes back to differences in values. Now, there's kind of 2 factors in play. One is the general version, which is just that each generation has come up with a different set of values and experiences, which are totally understandable. And that we are not the same as one another. We use different tools, we have different needs, we have different experiences. That's fine. But then there's the second factor, which is that you've got a lot of people in leadership who unfortunately fit some of the things that you're describing. They've either gotten into leadership or been placed in leadership for the wrong reasons, and they're approaching leadership in the wrong way for the current era. Maybe it was the right way for a previous era. So maybe they were great at one point. They were perfect for the job in whatever year. But in terms of what the world needs now, because things are so much more fast paced, things need to be more dynamic, more human. Customers have higher expectations. Like the needs are dramatically different. So it's not that the type of manager that I try to encourage doesn't exist. It's that there is nowhere near a high enough percentage of them in actual leadership positions. And so you've got this clash where the people in power are different and do not understand the needs of the workers, but the people in power need the workers because, like I said, you cannot do anything big without a team. You can't have a big, shareholder abundance creation machine if you don't have a big organization making all of the things happen. And so, what a lot of businesses experience is just like this unending tension between the two forces. In a lot of ways, the business just isn't behaving in a way that is in its own best interests. If it can't convince you for any other reason to change your behavior, then ultimately it should come back down to what do your customers expect and what do your customers need. But even then, people are just so convinced or their needs are so strong that they're unable to adapt. But it's not like it's not out there. And then I do think if it's possible for you, creating your own, starting your own business is great. We do need more people to do that. I wish we taught more young people how that process works because we don't teach them at all. Because not only do we need change to happen at these bigger corporations and in all different types of organizations, but we also do need a little fresh blood out there. We need fresh new organizations that started from the ground up.
And I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, entrepreneurship, I think there needs to be an entrepreneurship class, like at the high school level. And I completely agree with that. And I mean, you could apply this to parentage as well, where, you know, like your parents are saying, well, you know, like I was brought up this way, it should work for you. We grew up in very different worlds.
Yeah.
We grew up in very different worlds. Like I'm considered a geriatric millennial, a zennial, like, you know, on the cusp between Gen X and millennial, where I had an analog childhood but a digital adulthood. So I was in adolescence when I got my first computer, when we were introduced to chat rooms. I think I'm a good deal older than you. So like you're like chat rooms and AIM and AOL and, you know, like
Yeah.
When I was in kindergarten, our first computer had that just green tinted screen. It was a monochrome green tinted screen. So, but we were introduced to it, but we still knew what it was like to call our friends on our phone, ask for their, you know, like ask their parents for them and all of that.
There are
But
fortunately no digital pictures of me from my teen years, and I am so grateful. Just missed that cutoff.
So my mom digitized a lot of mine.
Oh no!
So
No,
there's a
thank you.
16-year-old me with blonde hair out there. And so you know, it's very it's nice to it's a very nice notion of knowing that we grew up in different worlds.
Yeah.
But it's also harder to convince those before us that we have experienced different worlds. We talk about generational divide, and it's like, well, you know, it's just another way to divide all of us. But in a way, it's sort of a way to explain why we experience the way that we do, what makes us tick.
Yeah.
Why folks our age are a part of that instant gratification era, you know, and also in growing up where we did, my first job out of college, I got a job right out of college. I was lucky to do it, but 2 years later, I got laid off and I couldn't find another full-time job for another 3 years.
Yep.
I was living with my parents in my early to mid-20s, and I was lucky enough to get a full-time job that paid peanuts. But I was living with my girlfriend, now wife, and she got into management. I think she was also 22 or 23 when she got into management, and she's very successful. She's been with the same company for 20 years now.
Oh, that's great.
So she's unbelievably successful at what she does. But she also works for a company that does profit sharing.
Oh, yes.
And they treat their employees well, and it also incentivizes them. It's like, well, it's literally our success is your success.
Yeah.
And vice
Which
versa.
everybody says, but that's only true if it's actually true, right? Like if you're going to give me some nominal prize when you hit a gigantic milestone, why should I care about that? But
like
in
cookies.
employee-owned, the cookies, yes. But in employee-owned businesses, or at least businesses with significant profit-sharing programs or with great like stock option programs, it is different. You have a different stake in the game.
You do. And so you were talking about Sephora with the cookies in one of your more recent TikToks, which I thought was hilarious. You know, I mean, it's up there with the pizza party, which we had plenty of pizza parties at my old job. So my first job, I worked for a magazine. It was actually a really good company to work for. I didn't get profit sharing, but it was at that time in the ancient mid 2000s. where it was for folks my age, in our early 20s coming out of college, that it was a privilege to have a job. And of course, like, we had to compete for the jobs. We still have to compete for jobs just because of how AI is working with applications that you mentioned in one of your other TikToks.
But the employment rate has changed dramatically.
It has.
Right? If you look over time, it is certainly true that it's difficult to get a job, especially in certain sectors, industries, locations, right? But the unemployment rate is dramatically different. So, for if you look back at the long history, there are periods of time where it was simply not possible to get a job. And I certainly know a lot of millennials in particular who spent a decade being underemployed, significantly underemployed, either because they couldn't get a job and so they went back for extra education, or simply because there weren't opportunities available. And that doesn't just start in the last 20 years. That goes back and ranges from different periods. And so you're correct. We've all had different experiences of the workforce. And so some of the things that were critical at one point in time, they're not relevant anymore, but that doesn't mean that they're not valid experiences.
Well, I mean, you'd mentioned, how hard it is to even get an interview, because usually when you get an interview, you're able to talk to a person, they're able to like consider your personality type. And you're right. There were other, like, there was the Great Depression, there was recessions in the 70s and 80s, the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And it was very hard. And in my industry, which we're gonna touch on that here in a minute, my industry, the entertainment industry, it's always very cutthroat. It's very cutthroat. And it's a much harder industry to get into. But what I want to delve into now, I'm going to share with you my bad boss story time.
Yeah.
So I worked in radio off and on for about 10 years, and I loved my job. I was the production director for a cluster of radio stations. I was in charge of making their commercials. I was also on the air. I was the music director for one of the stations. And then we got bought out by another company. And, one of my experiences and why I work for myself is I didn't have a say in what happened when this company bought us out.
Yeah.
And I have to answer to brand new people. And they brought in a new general manager, and they made all of these changes. They eliminated my position, which is the one that I enjoyed. It's the one I went to school for, which was production. It was production work. I was making commercials for all of these stations, and they eliminated that position, basically saying, oh, well, the other DJs can make their own commercials. It's fine. We really don't need you, but we want to keep you because you're a valuable commodity, and we're going to remember you. Or, hey, if you do this for me, we're going to remember you.
That gave me pain.
It is. We changed over a computer system. We changed over computer systems, and the new people came in. They were having trouble running commercials on all of these new stations on this new software. And I saw the code that they had, and it was a different code than what I had. And I said, no, you don't need to use this code. Use this code. And it saved my immediate boss's ass in a way. And he even came to me and he says, dude, you just saved our ass. And he says, we're going to remember you for this.
All right.
And how they remembered me for this was my bigger boss, the GM, said, you know what, Johnny, people like you. And you give tours of the station and people really enjoy it. And so what we want to do is we want to make you the first face that people see. And we want you to be the ambassador to our radio stations. And so what we want you to do is we want you to be at the front desk and let people in and be the first person that people talk to, which was a nice suck-up way of saying, we're going to stick you on the front desk. We're going to make
you in reception.
Yeah, they're putting me in reception. But apparently it was a managerial position, because what they also had me do was do what's called traffic. They had me process ad orders while still making commercials, while still being on air, while still being the makeshift engineer that I was.
What a
And
bargain. They were right.
right,
You are a
yeah,
valuable
I was
commodity.
very, very valuable commodity. How much coin flip? Do you think I got paid any more for it?
Oh God, I can't imagine. What was
No,
it?
no, no. I was making just over 20 grand a year at this job.
Oh.
A little education for you. Radio doesn't pay jack.
Yeah.
But that was my bad boss story.
Yeah.
He would scream at the top of his lungs at all of his sales staff. And then he would come to me and he would like try to shift things around. And I'm like, dude, you can't bullshit me. You can't.
Yeah.
Like I understand what you're doing, but they had me wear all of these different hats and they put me in a position where I was processing these ad orders and it was data entry. And granted, 16 years, I found out that I had ADHD. And so it was a tedious, mind-numbing position
Yeah.
where I was doing repetitive tasks. You would think simply easy tasks. Eventually, we had a little come-to-Jesus meeting. My immediate supervisor had a stack of paperwork getting ready to fire me, and I just fell on my own sword, and I said, listen, I'm not trained for this position that you put me in. I know you eliminated my other position. Let me just work part-time and stick to what I'm good at.
Yeah.
And
okay.
then, but 2 months later, they cut all part-time hours.
Mm.
And so like that's my bad boss story time. So, and this was 2012 when this happened. And like my last day on air, I even said, because it was right before the end of the world, the end of the Mayan calendar. And I said, okay, well, if you don't hear from me next week, you know what happened. And that was my last day on air because they told me the following week that they're cutting all part-time hours. And of course, they told me it was temporary, but it wasn't. And that's when I started to go into business for myself. Mm. But it was, but I told myself from then on, I'm like, I'm not going to put myself at the mercy of somebody else. I'm not going to answer to somebody else. If I do work for somebody else, I'm going to have complete autonomy. And I had that, but I messed up that position, but we won't go into that. But it was an entertainment industry position, and it was one of those where you had to say yes.
Yeah.
It was where you had to say yes, and it was basically they say jump, you say how high.
Yeah.
And it comes to the TikTok that you posted where the one person said, we're going to have an 8 a.m. meeting. Can you do it? And it's like, we have a workout. And it's like, no, you signed up for this. You're coming in at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
But... you know, now you're talking about like we're going to go into the paradigm shift. You know, the last few years we've been out of office. We've been doing remote work, and the return to office, the RTO, but we're used to working from home. We don't have to work in an office. We don't have to commute 30 minutes a day if we have a job where we can work remotely.
Yeah.
I loved your reaction video to the WebMD return to work video and crushing the competition. Crushing what competition? Is there another website out there that makes people paranoid that they have cancer?
Yeah. Yeah, that was so just like out of touch, right? Because, and obviously they never intended for consumers to see that. But first of all, it's so easy for those things to get leaked. It was on a Vimeo link, I'm pretty sure. And so, you know, a couple minutes later, it could be anywhere, right? Which is the same for like any Zoom call you're on, emails you send, and especially videos that you put out. And I'm pretty sure they produced that video themselves. And so clearly
it was very poorly done. So,
well, clearly they didn't think anybody was going to see it. And so they're using this very strange, like pump you up language that then when you look at it from the outside and you say, like, is this what WebMD is really about? Like, who are they even talking to? Like, am I not the customer? They're talking, I think, about things like advertisers and how they're structured and like they're talking like a tech company, but that's not who they how they represent themselves to the public. So they got exposed in a pretty significant way there, and the RTO branding does not help.
Do you think because we've been doing remote work for so long, do you think that companies should compensate? If you're going to do RTO, then if you're going to have RTO, if you're going to require people to commute, do you think they should compensate personal vehicle mileage, count your commute as time in the company, like as time spent, because you're returning to a place that you're required to be to be at rather, that wasn't a requirement for the last 4 years.
It's a good question. It's an interesting sort of thought experiment, but you have to sort of look at like no company is doing that. Your commute time has never been counted as working time, nor is your commute location ever really treated that way. But to me, it's not a question of should they or shouldn't they. There are some factors that we have to be honest about. And then it comes back to, well, what is really necessary here? Because what's really necessary is building the team, making sure there's communication amongst the team members, and then driving the results that we want. Now, there's also a enormous corporate lease that we have to satisfy that a lot of businesses have backed themselves into. And then you've got your sort of rogue executive team who are unable to manage remotely. That's another enormous factor that's driving this movement. I don't foresee that happening except for in a very rare number of cases. But the thing that could happen is that businesses could keep a little bit more perspective, and they could say, we know we have different types of needs on a day-to-day basis. We need good communication. We need clear hours, clear processes, this and that. We need our team. But on some sort of basis, annual, maybe twice a year, we have a need for, to bring people together. And I do see companies that pay for that, right? So they bring you in, everybody's going to be in the same place for 4 days. We're going to serve this purpose while we're there. Maybe that's primarily for bonding, but maybe it's primarily for some other purpose like product development, brainstorming, something like that. That can work just fine. And yes, companies should compensate. Obviously they should pay for the expenses and they should take that pretty seriously.
Yeah. Especially. Oh, go ahead.
I don't think they're going to ever pay for commuting. I mean, we used to see things like you could get reimbursed for your train pass or something like that. I think that's pretty rare though.
Yeah. I think I would say though, because they're pushing this message of how necessary it is to return to the office. And you're right. They're trying to justify their overhead. They're trying to justify the lease that they have on these office buildings.
Yep.
And granted, I had this back, when everybody was remote working, during the shutdown. And, I live in Florida. You live in Philly. You had a very different experience. Did I just dox you? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I got my sign right there.
Okay. Oh, Philadelphia. There you go. So I take it Jason Kelce is your god right now. So
I mean, who doesn't love Jason Kelce?
Jason Kelce is so great. He's so lovable. He is
character.
lovable. He is so lovable. But back on the topic, like you live in a bigger city. I live in the sticks. I live in it's the Florida Panhandle, what we like to call Lower Alabama.
Oh yeah.
And Florida had much looser regulations on everything. Talked about opening back up, and we were one of the first states to open back up. We won't go into the politics of it all, but whether or not people agree with it or not, but in Philly, you had remote work for a very long time, whereas here in Florida, we did not. It was back to the office. Now, we still have and allow for remote working as an option. But, now, so many years later, because we've become so accustomed to working at home and because we've become so entrenched, and it's like, why the hell were we going to the office in the first place?
Yeah.
You think of the movie Office Space and, like the cubicles. Like my first job out of college, I was in a cubicle.
Oh, yeah.
I was in a cubicle.
There's all these little cultural things that developed in that space for that space.
Yeah. And it's soul sucking. And you would think that people would know that it's soul sucking.
Yeah.
It very TPS reports
lights.
The fluorescent lights.
Yep.
I mean, I have LEDs shining on me right now, but we found out that fluorescent lighting was bad for you. Like constant exposure to fluorescent lighting was bad for you. The constant exposure to sounds of phones ringing and everything was poor for your psyche.
Yeah,
There
the
are
open floor
people,
plan is
yeah, the
really
open
just,
floor, it was bad. It's
yeah.
it's horrible. It's like, oh, so that you can just kind of pop your head over and talk to whoever you need, or that your boss can pop his head over and see what you're actually doing.
Yeah. You ever have those
But
short cubicles, the one that
yeah,
you
the
can't
short
stand up
ones.
in, where
Yep.
everybody can see
And
the top of
yeah,
your head?
everybody can see the top of your head. And I know for a fact, my first job out of college, I was very much like Peter Gibbons, where I said, I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working.
Mm-hmm.
And and again, undiagnosed ADHD, that was sort of like what happened with me. But I got a lot of work done, and I was able to get work done in a few hours when I had a deadline available. And so now we're going to go into the next subject, accommodations.
Mm-hmm.
Accommodations for people with disabilities like ADHD, autism, physical disabilities, ADA stuff. But more for the accommodations of people who, can't work in a traditional 9 to 5 cubicle office space. What are some innovations that you've seen that have really helped with those accommodations?
One thing that is really helpful is to even be conscious of the concept of cognitive diversity in the workplace. So, the traditional workplace works well for a very narrow group of people that have a certain set of characteristics, and they're willing to do or they're able to do a certain set of things, like sit in one spot for a long period of time for 8 to 10 hours a day. That what the workplace does is it makes that seem so normalized and standardized that there's no other option except for you to accept it or to simply not be here at all. But that's honestly a false binary. There are all different types of people with all different thinking styles and levels of physical ability, excuse me. And the real honesty is to take a look at what type of work needs to be completed, what's necessary for that work to be successful, and then how can we ensure that it's completed in a satisfactory way. Now, if you get hung up on some of the traditional trappings that people are used to seeing, even in your example, if you think about, so you've got a group of people who came up at the same time as you, and those people were promoted up into corporate leadership and they ended up in these positions, whatever. So perhaps they said, okay, this is a successful strategy, like must be here. That's the cornerstone of being a office worker is you must be here. You should be staring at that computer, like waiting for the request to come in or whatever it is. And so they've really sort of like tied everything so tightly to that as opposed to actually tying it to the performance. If we're aware of building a workplace that supports cognitive diversity, then you can approach this in a completely different way. Instead of offering everybody the same setup, for example, or even the same hours, for example, if that's not necessary, let's take the data entry, right? The data's all got to be entered by this time. So if it can be entered from any location and during any period of time using, these appropriate guidelines and rules, then it really benefits managers to be open and supportive about that, because that's how you can have a great person in that job doing a great job in that function. It works so much better. And personally, I'll tell you my philosophy, which is that I'm trying to build kinship and support between people who want to move in this direction. I'm not necessarily trying to force people who don't want to change, but I am trying to create new workspaces with people like you and me and your listeners and others where we can work together in a way that works for us, that generates great results. You have a great team. I find a lot more value in approaching things that way because some people are never going to change their minds.
Nope.
And that's not my function here on earth, is to force them to change. I'm trying to build a different movement with different results.
You're trying to make it to where like managers who say we're a family actually mean it, instead of the, red flag of, no, this is a well, no, it's a family, but it's the toxic family with
Yeah, the thing
the
that's ironic about the family is honestly, a lot of times that's the case where they, are emotionally abusive or,
yes.
whatever those things are. But what I'm trying to build is if you're going to be a
Right.
manager, you have to actually care about your people. I talk about that in the book. It's so ridiculously basic, and yet it is a revolutionary idea because some people are good at pretending to care about people because they did read a couple management books in the past. But for most people, that's a completely foreign concept.
It is because it's like, well, I'm paying them. It's a privilege for them to.
Yes,
That
the
that's
old
the
Don
mindset.
Draper. That's what the money
Yeah,
is for.
yeah, that's what the money's for. Like, I care about you. Here's the money,
Yep,
but they don't think. Conversely, it's like I'm. As the employee, I'm the reason that your company is functioning,
absolutely. Yep. I
and
am here
so
every day
like
making this happen for you.
yeah, exactly. And it's, like you're compensating me for your success. And you're like I'm not even asking for stock options on this.
Yeah.
It's like you're having me do a job that you can't do yourself
Yes.
or that you need someone else's help to do. So yeah, that's the even exchange. And if you want me to do more, pay me more and don't give me this carrot on a stick of, oh, well, you could be promoted down the road. Like you'll be remembered if you're promoted down the road. No, like that doesn't make for better employees. It makes for better kiss asses. It makes for better, and if anything, it influences those who think that way, who think that they're able to get that brass ring or that carrot on a stick and burn themselves out and make themselves less productive.
Yeah. And we have a very burnt out workforce now as a result of that. But you have to, we have to be more honest about these things because, if we accept that it's normal to just push and push and push to the point of burnout and exhaustion, there's a lot of things that are just baked into the workforce that reinforce that message that this is normal. And so you talked about like even exchange. One thing that I like to point out is businesses want to pay below average wages and then they want to demand above average work. So we're not even starting from a baseline of a fair exchange. We're starting from a baseline of an unfair exchange. The idea of like your overcompensated, work hard, play hard professional honestly has almost like gone extinct because maybe like there's a couple industries where that's still somewhat of a reality. But because of sort of wealth inequality at this point, even pretty good, solid positions are not being paid where a person's going to live this luxurious lifestyle. If
No.
you are a cog in the machine, at best, you're living a comfortable lifestyle or a
Yep.
healthy lifestyle. And so just businesses have become out of touch on this issue. They still think that what they're offering is great when it's pretty mediocre because they've cut things down to the bone, like as much as they possibly could. And now they're confused about why they have this problem. They overmined the mine, and now it is empty and decrepit and tired and dark. And they are confused about why the
Well,
continued jackhammering
yeah.
isn't generating the same kind of results as it did before.
It's like keep doing what you're doing. But I think it's, especially with publicly traded companies or
Yes.
even like privately owned, where they have shareholders.
Yeah.
Publicly traded companies, they have shareholders. They're trying to appease their shareholders, not necessarily the people who are working under them. And profit sharing, I believe, can alleviate a lot of that. Just stock options. I go into Office Space again. He says, if I work my ass off and ship out, a few more units, I don't see another dime.
Yeah.
Or, well, if you want that raise, then, you need to get it, like, again, it's dangling a carrot. It's,
Yeah.
you're not incentivizing. There should be, like you've talked about, clear, concise, procedures. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, if you're going to put out this much stuff, you are guaranteed this, and this. And it can't be based, it needs to be completely quantitative, not qualitative. Like,
Yes.
They try to quantify everything, even in evaluations. It's one is below expectations, five is above and beyond expectations.
Yes.
Or but what about if you meet expectations? If you meet
Yeah.
expectations and you're compensated for it, the quiet quitting thing. It's like, oh, there was a guy at this meeting that I was at, and he says, well, we have this culture of the clock watchers, the people who show up right at
Oh,
9 o'clock and they watch the clock and then they leave right at 5. I'm like, I'm showing up and leaving during my allotted time that we agreed on and that you're paying me for.
yeah. For me,
And
the
you,
ones that are
yeah,
worse are the ones who are watching your clock, right? So not just like, okay, when am I here?
time
When am I
theft,
leaving? No, yeah, exactly. Accusing you of time
time
theft. Your
theft.
colleague sits down who says, I'm protecting the company by pointing out that Susan was 5 minutes late today. We all need to get a grip on that. Like it's not about the 5 minutes. If you have a job where you are responsible for like punching something in, punching something out, first of all, I would be surprised if you haven't been replaced by a machine at this point.
Right.
But second of all, like that's not the type of work and the type of workforce and business that we are running in 2024. That's just not reality right now. We need to put less emphasis on the time and more emphasis on those results.
Yes.
And just some people just aren't prepared for that. And so, because they're so paranoid, or because they're so deeply, deeply tied to certain values, they can't help themselves. And that
Yep.
is extremely unproductive.
I worked at the Smile Box company for 5 days.
Oh, God.
There was a center very close to where I lived. I worked there for 5 days, uh, under contract because that's how they do it. It's all contractors. There's
Sure.
no actual. There's very few actual employees, and if they are, they're in management. And I remember, it's like, oh, I mean, they had half of the number of people that they should have distributing the products that they had, unloading and distributing the products that they had, and having them ready to ship off. Again, they had half the people. Uh, Granted, they gave us allotted breaks at certain times because they had to. But then when we came back from those breaks, I remember one of the supervisors saying to me, your break was over at 2:15, not 2:17. And it's like, well, it takes us 2 minutes to walk back to this thing. Are you saying that we need to cut into our required 15-minute break to start walking towards the assembly line? And then that same day, I had a bunch of boxes nearly fall on top of me. Screamed out loud, no one batted an eye.
Mm.
A few days beforehand, my carpal tunnel was acting up. I had like the worst feeling of carpal tunnel, very painful, barely could pick up anything with my arm. And they said, well, we don't have any bandages. Just go in and grab a couple extra gloves and just wrap it around your wrist and come right back out. I'm
Uh,
like you're talking about how safety is your priority, but
they love to say that.
they love to
And
say it.
yet,
They love to say it, but they're full of it.
yeah,
They're full of it.
they've complied with the minute. What they really mean is that
Yeah.
they've complied with the minimum regulations
Yeah,
there.
they did it so that they could say it. They could
Yes.
actually
They
say
gave
it and
themselves a
have
little seal of
yeah,
approval.
plausible deniability,
Yes.
and put it on the fault of the worker if needs be.
Yeah,
But
and
it,
and what you're
yeah,
describing happens at scale. And the thing is that when you look at it at
yeah,
scale, the gaps make themselves apparent. So if you have done your workforce planning, a lot of the big issues all come back to the same types of things. It comes back to workloads and it comes back to compensation. If you are doing your your workforce planning, assuming that you've got these shifts and that the output of the shift begins at exactly this minute, and then it goes until exactly this time, and you haven't accounted for anything else to take place in between those two things, then you need to staff so that you've got your next person who is there, like waiting behind the other person. You have to have enough coverage to create that overage. If not, then you're actually just being really unrealistic and you've made incorrect calculations in what the output can be for whatever this period of time is. And what's happened is again, like you talked about quantifying, what businesses will do is they will say, well, maybe we could get just a little bit more. If we put a little bit more pressure, or maybe, if you compare these two people, this person can do a little bit more. I could get a little extra 5%, 10%, 20%. And they are taking advantage of those differences to as much as they possibly can, and they are pressuring those things into existence as much as they possibly can, which ultimately is them not taking responsibility for appropriate workforce planning, putting the resources in place. And so then what they'll do is they'll blame you for the output of, well, you didn't meet the quota that we think you should be able to meet, but they don't ever take responsibility for that you didn't set the conditions up for that quota
Yeah,
in the first place.
exactly. They talk
It happens
about
in every job.
it happens in every job, and you're talking about at scale because they use analytics.
Yeah.
Like this is you say, or like, it's like, oh, well, I'm like, we need at least twice as many people here.
Yeah.
And they said, well, there's a reason that they're a multi-billion dollar company, almost
Congratulations.
trillion dollar company now.
Yep.
And it's because they are micromanaging your productivity. They are tracking your productivity at a scale. They're tracking every single thing that you do on such a microscopic scale, but then that adds up to the much bigger scale. And they say, well, if we tweak this person a little bit, we tweak this person a little bit, we tweak this person a little bit, we apply just a little bit more pressure on this person. And if we apply this much pressure on the thousands of people that we have working for us, then we can ship out all of that extra stuff.
Yeah, and that works with machines, but it doesn't
Yeah,
really work with people.
it doesn't work with people. And we're at that point now where we can have machines, but we will always need people for certain things that, until we build like a T1000, liquid metal person, to be able to do the same task that a human can do, they're always going to need human resources.
Well, and you have to be responsible with those
Yes.
resources.
Yes.
So invariably, there are people that work for your business. And so, yeah, employ as much technology as possible. Employ as much, physical technology as possible. Great. I don't want to do those tasks either because they're much better for a robot to do, a conveyor belt, that type of thing.
I saw that I got you fired up when I mentioned the Smilebox store.
Well, and so, but what it comes down to is you have to be responsible with managing the resources that are under your care. So, it depends on what the work is. If I expect you to be able to do creative problem solving, if I expect you to be able to manage a extended process or a significant portion of my business, I have to put those conditions into place. And so many businesses simply don't, and then they wait to see what happens. And as long as there's not an all-out failure, they consider it to be a success. And then, of course, there is the Wall Street component, right? It's very difficult for a business to post increased earnings every single quarter. And that's what Wall Street demands. And so there is this pressure that happens at every single level of the organization. And that's why I do think fresh organizations are hugely beneficial, because if you've resourced your business considering like in the kind of structure that you've described, it's very hard to come back from that. It's almost impossible because you've created this structure and there's no way to feed more resources into it without affecting the overall financial performance of the business. But can we imagine a different way to perform something similar? I think a lot of businesses don't realize how vulnerable they are, and that if someone comes along who can do it better, can do it more efficiently, and can do it under better conditions, customers will flock.
I think if more companies showed, and not just a facade, but like actually had people and showed people that they are actually enjoying their job, I think that they could actually increase their profit margin.
You can.
So I agree.
It's not traditional, but that's absolutely a relevant factor. Otherwise, customers are just going to go for the absolute cheapest option that works best for them.
And then, of course, that incentivizes companies to, cut corners and everything like that. But because they want to make sure that little arrow goes up
Yes.
like in the WebMD video.
Yes.
You know,
Up towards
so
nothing. It's so common. Yep.
it is, and they want to show, it's all a show, is all it is
Yeah.
they want to be able to say that they did something, and that's it. um and I think when you get to these, and of course, like buying small, spend a little more to buy small, because it's, like, I'm all about local businesses, and yes, you're going to have to spend a little more, but you're still supporting a business that, their money is going to go and stimulate that local economy.
Yeah.
Um, but what you sound like you were going to say something. Sorry.
No, it's true if you can, right? It's not within reach for everybody, but when you can, it helps to know as much as you can about the business that you're buying from, to be aware as a consumer. And consumers are pretty aware, and that information flows pretty freely. So there is a big spotlight on every business in the world. Like we're all interested to see what's going on back there.
All right. Well, Robyn, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. I really do appreciate it. Robyn Garrett, the author of Happy at Work: How to Create a Happy, Engaging Workplace for Today's and Tomorrow's Workforce. You can buy her book on the Smilebox Place, along with a lot of other resources. You also have the audio version of the book.
Yes.
For people who are like me and don't really read books per se, but are able to process information auditorily.
Yep.
So, and you're also on TikTok, Instagram, all the socials, and you're on TikTok. You're almost at that 100K threshold,
It's
right?
close. Yeah, come
It's
along.
close. Are you going to have a pizza party when you hit that 100K?
Oh my God, that's terrible. Maybe we'll see. But I am looking forward to it. I'm sort of looking at my Instagram has grown really quickly. So I'm looking at
Yes.
both platforms. Like, where can I hit the 100K first?
Yes.
It looks like it'll be TikTok, but it might be Instagram. Instagram has grown very quickly.
Yeah, it has. And so thank you for taking your time to talk to a tiny little podcast that doesn't even have 100 followers, at least right now. So
It's been
I
great to
appreciate
talk
it.
with you. Yeah. And
All
thank
right.
you, everybody,
All
for
right.
listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Robyn.